I went to the Olympics in Athens in 2004. Had been my goal for years. And really, in a small sport like mountain biking, the Olympics are really the thing that everyone's gunning for, because it's sort of the one thing that transcends. Domestically, I had a lot of success. So won 12 U.S. national championships across a few different disciplines. And my wife was also a professional racer, and we both won the cross-country national championships on the same day in 2009. The big picture is like a 4-year cycle that you're working towards to peak for a certain event. And certainly within a year, you're operating on a longer time scale. So I think Bitcoin, athletes would be very comfortable with the length that it takes to realize the benefits. And it's like, they think the idea of a proof of work where there's real substance behind it, instead of something like the US dollar, that's resonant with athletes, because no one can do your training for you, and there aren't shortcuts. Like, you have to, if you don't put in the work, it's evident to yourself pretty quickly that you're not going to get the result. We've been, I would say pretty much all in since 2020. And yeah, family living on a Bitcoin standard these days.
This podcast is entertainment, not financial, tax, or legal advice. Views expressed represent statements of the speaker in their individual capacity, do not represent the views of Unchained, and should not be considered investment advice. Speakers often have personal, family, or business connections to Unchained, which may include direct financial benefits. Please see our disclosure at unchained.com/podcast.
Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the Bitcoin Frontier podcast. This week I have on Jeremy Nova. Jeremy, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, glad to have you. This will be a really interesting podcast episode. I'm excited to hear and learn more about you. Can we kind of start off with your journey into professional mountain biking? Like, how did you get started, with that sport?
Yeah, good, great place to start. So, so I actually started it was a middle school trip in 8th grade. When it was a mountain bike trip. It was part of school. And I felt it was the first thing I think I've really ever totally fallen in love with. And so I jumped right into it. I started racing really seriously in high school. It was a pretty young sport back then still. Now high school mountain bike racing is a really well-developed, there's a whole infrastructure around it. But when I was doing it back then, it was not that there was hardly anything. So I actually, by the end of my high school career, I was already traveling over to Europe to race in the World Championships as a junior. I did go to college, thought about skipping college, but wanted to have something to fall back on if the bike racing thing didn't pan out. So got a degree in applied math from the University of Colorado, and then raced through my collegiate days there. They had a really good collegiate team. And so raced in college. Right around the end of my collegiate career, sort of got my pro break, had a couple of really good results at the national level. I was hired to Ralph Lauren, had a big team at the time. So raced for them, RLX Ralph Lauren from 2002 to 2004, and then raced for the Trek Factory World Cup team from about 2005 to 2016. So it was a good, real good journey. That's the super quick summary, but that was the quick journey.
I like it. What was kind of the thing that made you really fall in love with mountain biking? Like I've been mountain biking a few times, and I'm by far no expert, but it is kind of fun. But I didn't, I guess, fall in love with it like right away. Like, what made you really love mountain biking?
I mean, I always loved the outdoors, right? I think like being outdoors, I always felt in my element. But I think in mountain bike racing in particular, I never fell in love with team sports. I loved like the individual pursuit of mountain biking, like getting out and pushing yourself. I was a cross country racer, so I loved, riding uphill hard and, just sort of that physical exertion out in the woods and the thrill of riding too. I mean, and then as I wound down my cross country racing career, transitioned into enduro, which is more, downhill fun focused. And that really re-enlivened my passion in the late years of my career, just for, shredding great single track and racing against the clock. So it was just something I always found thrilling, and it was amazing to be able to make a career out of it for 15 years.
Nice. Yeah, that's awesome. Has there been anything in mountain biking that like experienced your life? I would imagine, like the trials and the endurance might be helpful for like just general life purposes, but is there anything in particular that you can think of?
Oh, for sure. I mean, I have 2 young kids now. They're 6 and 8, and I have no desire to say make them into professional athletes, but I certainly hope that they do something competitive, because I think that the life lessons you learn from competitive athletics are just, phenomenal. There's no substitute for it. A professional racing career is filled with far more disappointment than victory. Typically, that's pretty much true for even the top racers. Like you don't win every race, even the people that you see on the podium, week in and week out. There's a lot of hardship, a lot of hard hours behind the scenes. And I think it's a real, like the competition in general is a really good venue for a lot of personal growth. And I think set me up well for, sort of being invested in my own personal growth beyond the racing years.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I can definitely relate to that. I feel like, waking up when I was a kid, like going to different practices, playing different sports, losing, going to tournaments and stuff. So I can definitely relate. Yeah, that's very interesting. What was like your most proud achievement, maybe like during your mountain biking career?
There's a few that jump out. I think so. I mean, obviously, I went to the Olympics in Athens in 2004. Had been my goal for years. And really, in a small sport like mountain biking, the Olympics are really the thing that everyone's gunning for because it's sort of the one thing that transcends, even a small sport. A lot of people don't necessarily know that much about mountain biking, but if you tell me you went to the Olympics, it always means something. So I think that was and that was a real hard fought effort to get there. And do that. That was certainly a proud moment. I had a couple flashes of, brilliance on the international scene over that long career, got on a couple World Cup podiums. And, I was never one of the top people internationally week in, week out, but got to that level a few times. And so to be able to really mix it up at the front of those races was really thrilling. And then domestically, I had a lot of success. So won 12 US national championships across a few different disciplines over the years. And so those US victories were really meaningful. One day that jumps out to me, my wife was also a professional racer and we both won the cross country national championships on the same day in 2009. So as a single day that stands out, that was a big one. Nice.
Did you meet her while you were mountain biking or how did you meet her?
We actually met in college. So mountain biking was a shared interest, but it wasn't, we didn't necessarily meet on the bike, but it turned into a career for both of us that we ended up sharing.
Nice. That's very interesting. You mentioned like their various disciplines. Can you kind of elaborate on like what that means for?
Yeah. So the mountain biking. So cross country is, that's like the Olympic format. So when I was racing, it was about a 2-hour race. It's shorter now. It's about an hour and a half. So up, down, multi-lap format. Short track is a shorter discipline where it's like a 1 to 2 minute lap and you only race for about 20 minutes. They usually use that as like a kind of a prelude to the cross country weekend. And then there's downhill, which is just, chairlift, serve, full face helmets, pads. You race from the top of the mountain to the bottom, timed. Did only a handful of downhill races, but then enduro, I did quite a bit toward the end of my career, which is you generally do like a long time course, but only the downhill sections are timed. But it requires a high level of fitness because there's usually a lot of pedaling within the descending sections. And then you also have to typically ride between the descending points. So you're climbing a lot and it requires a high level of fitness. So there's a brief overview of the mountain bike thing.
Nice. Do you have a preference on like which one you like best?
I mean, cross country and enduro were really the only ones that I ever really did fully. And so I think between both of those, I had those were both my two.
Nice. Can you kind of maybe share a story about the Olympics? Like obviously I watch the Olympics, every time it's on. I'm definitely, not an Olympic athlete at all, not even close, but you kind of share like what it was like.
I mean, I think living in the athlete village is really, I think the most amazing part of that, or was for me actually, like you're around all of these other athletes and everyone is at the pinnacle of their sport. Right. And so you have all the different body types are like amazing. Like I'd be standing in line next to like, a women's volleyball player who's a head and a half taller than me, in the cafeteria line, and I'm 6'1", and so that's uncommon. And then you've got weightlifters next to like tiny gymnasts and just this variety of all of these athletes that come together into one giant, village for that month. It was an amazing experience. So.
Yeah, it's very cool. So I guess you're just around like the most athletic humans on planet Earth, and like that's kind of hard to describe.
Yeah, pretty much.
That's awesome. How big of a sport is mountain biking? Like is it like, obviously it's not massive. It's not like football or soccer, but like like any idea of how big it really is?
It's a big sport in Europe. So in Europe, it's closer, like, and road cycling even more so. Like road cycling, Tour de France type racing, that's like an A-tier sport in Europe. It's on live TV. Mountain biking is probably pretty close to that in Europe. So in North America, it's more of a niche sport. There are people here making a living doing it still. They're competitive on the international scene. But in Europe, it's pretty close to like a top tier sport over there. And it's, widely integrated to like schools and in the culture. And so you have a huge talent pool coming up from pretty much all the countries there. And it's the races are, there's huge attendance. You'll get 40, 50,000 spectators, on a mountain bike cross country course. And then it is televised there too. So, bigger over there than here. And we spent a big chunk of our year racing in Europe,
Wow. Yeah, it's very cool. I'm curious, how has it changed over the years? Like, is it very different now from what it was 10 or 20 years ago?
Yeah, it is. It's a lot different. I mean, when I started, I really started racing in like the early to mid 90s, and mountain bike racing was it was like the real young, new extreme sport then, and pretty big in the US, like growing, but it was the Wild West. Like there was no, there was no real infrastructure for it. There wasn't really a lot of governing body support or anything. And that has changed a lot. It's professionalized a lot over the years. It's gone through a few different iterations of, I would say, professionalism and change. There are big teams now. There's more money at the elite level. Internationally, the courses have become quite a bit shorter and more manicured. When I started, it was much longer loops. It was not as spectator friendly, and it's become more of like almost more of a made for TV event at the World Cup cross country level, which, as someone who got to race both kind of pre and kind of, it was already kind of like that when I retired. It was more fun for me as a racer before, as opposed to what it became. But it's been a net benefit for the sport for sure. There's more people that are able to make a living at it. Sponsorships are more lucrative for athletes that succeed. So I think it's been growing up really over the last 20 years.
Yeah, well, that's good to hear for the sport in general, I guess. What are like the sponsorship packages or like the race prizes now? Do you have any idea?
Usually, I mean, I don't really know specifically, but usually it's a team structure where you'd have a team would be put together with with title sponsorship from both in and out of industry sponsors. So you may have, like within an industry sponsor, like a Trek Bicycles, would be the bike sponsor, provide all the equipment, a lot of the funding for the team. And then there'll also be typically a co-sponsorship, co-title if someone outside. Subaru was a partner for us for years, provided money, vehicles, things like that in exchange for title sponsorship for the team. And then athletes are typically hired under that umbrella. And even though you don't compete as a team, it's an individual sport. You usually, you get pretty close to your teammates who are all pursuing individual goals, but, sort of under this shared team infrastructure.
Does everyone how big is the professional US mountain biking? How big is that squad? Like, does everyone kind of know each other, or is it still kind of like separate?
It's a good question. I mean, I think probably at any given time, there's probably a couple hundred people in the US that would hold, say, a professional license. And then a small subset of those are, probably see each other week in, week out at big races.
Nice. Very cool. Very interesting. What were like your original plans after you finished professional mountain biking? Like, did you have an idea of what you wanted to do?
I didn't actually. I was fortunate that I had kind of a bit of a long runway out. And I think this is probably maybe good segue into the Bitcoin portion of the conversation here. But I didn't really. I think a lot of professional athletes struggle with that, what that career path looks like, especially if you've had a long career and you've really like never been in the workforce until you're older and, retiring from an athlete career. That said, I always did kind of I had a lot of irons in the fire, everything from, real estate investments to, I did start a business, in 2008 with a business partner. It's called Studio Shed. It's a design build, not really design build, but small prefab, architecture, everything from like single room backyard studios to like accessory dwelling units. That company was successful. I'm still involved today. So was able to sort of cultivate an entrepreneurial exit, which is pretty common for athletes, moving out of their racing careers.
Nice. So yeah, you basically became you knew you wanted to do like something different. Like you couldn't just jump into like a full-fledged career that people graduating college did.
People joke that the professional athlete careers of any type, you're sort of unemployable after, right? Because you've spent a long time, answering to no one but yourself.
In this frontier moment, Jeremy jokingly said professional athletes are unemployable after their sports careers. While of course that's not exactly the case, it is true that professional athletes earn a lot of money early in their careers, and then they see a sharp decline in their income. Let's think about how saving in Bitcoin may give athletes more certainty around a successful retirement. A $1 million portfolio in stocks growing at 7% per year would last around 12 years, withdrawing $100,000 per year, inflation adjusted by 3% each year. On the other hand, a $1 million portfolio in Bitcoin growing at just 13% per year would last around 38 years, withdrawing $100,000 per year, inflation adjusted by 3% each year. So just by obtaining a slightly higher compound annual growth rate with Bitcoin, athletes could extend their retirement by multiple decades. And now back to Jeremy.
Which you have to very rigorously to be successful, but you're sort of a square peg in the round hole in the corporate world for most people.
Yeah, it's funny, but I guess it kind of does make sense. I guess, can you kind of tell us about like how you discovered Bitcoin and how that may have changed like your perspective on so many different things?
Yeah, it was actually pretty late in my racing career. I mean, mostly because Bitcoin wasn't around for most of it. But I think to set the stage, I think during one of the things that like you had just alluded to, as you get towards the end of your career, there's this natural, sort of like, what am I going to do next, right? And for both my wife and myself, we invested in, real estate during our racing careers, plowed money into that to try to say, hey, like, what does the runway look like, when we're not making money racing anymore? Let's have something we can fall back on while we try to, sort of quote, figure out the next thing. I didn't learn about Bitcoin until 2015. The first time I heard it, we were actually the latter part of our racing career. We were driving around in an Airstream doing like cool participant driven enduro events. And so we're on the road a lot for racing, and that way was really fun. We'll listen to a lot of podcasts, and randomly just plugged into one of Andreas Antonopoulos' podcasts and got it was really interesting. It was Joe Rogan with Andreas Antonopoulos. And that was the first time I learned about Bitcoin. And then from there, got interested in it, bought some on Coinbase in 2015, forgot about it. I hadn't done the work yet. It was just this thing I had heard about. And then when the sort of I just completely forgot about it. And then the bull market started taking off in 2016, 2017. And then I got this email from Coinbase about, the fork and Bitcoin Cash and all this stuff. And I was like, what is this? I should look at it. I'm like, oh, there's like real money in here now and what's going on. And I think that was the catalyst for me doing my 10,000 hours into Bitcoin. And so I would say I would probably consider myself, even though I started in 2015, probably culturally more like class of 2017 for Bitcoin. And then it's just gone, it's snowballed from there, and it touches every aspect of sort of your life and philosophy and, going forward. And then we've been, I would say pretty much all in since 2020. And yeah, family living on a Bitcoin standard these days.
Nice. Yeah, it's really cool to hear. I definitely want to dive deeper into, how you guys think about Bitcoin or how you think about Bitcoin. But like when you first bought Bitcoin in 2015 and you didn't know much about it and you were just kind of curious, like, did you expect the number to go up a lot, or were you buying it because you thought the number would go up a lot, or how did you think about it?
Not really initially. Like, I think, it's hard to remember. Like, I was thinking about this ahead of the podcast, even like, what was it that was captivating? I actually was always captivated by probably like the freedom element of it. And honestly, the lack of counterparty risk. Like, I lived through I remember I had a stock portfolio, for financial crisis in 2008. And I followed that like pretty closely. I've always been kind of a macroeconomic dork. I would read The Economist on the plane on the way to races and stuff like that. So I've always like followed that and been interested in it, and kind of watched what happened in the financial crisis. But again, didn't learn about Bitcoin right away. It wasn't until years later. But that element was always interesting to me, like that kind of, and then really when you go down the rabbit hole and learn about self-custody and what that really means, and like all of the, sort of to have sovereign control of your money and what is money? Like those questions became very interesting. So it was actually more about that even originally than number go up, although that's nice too.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, especially since I guess you learned about it initially from Andreas. He's kind of more not, promising number go up,
right?
Say he's more about the freedom and sovereignty. But yeah, I mean, what made you very curious on like macroeconomics, or like what made you start thinking about like finance and investing in general?
It's probably, I think some of it probably goes back to what I was saying earlier, where you're trying to figure out how to like how to extend your not extend your career necessarily, but sort of create a soft landing for an athlete. I think this was one of the questions that you had posed to me before, is this sort of like why, like what are the advantages of Bitcoin for, say, a professional athlete? And I know there are quite a few professional athlete Bitcoiners. I think one thing is that professional athlete, you really bring forward your high earning years, sometimes really dramatically, right? You hear about stories, whether it's NFL players or whoever else, they earn a ton of money, like right out of college, and, and then it's gone. Right. And so there's an interesting dynamic there where professional athletes have an ability to earn money pretty young. And then Bitcoin is a very interesting way to preserve that purchasing power into the future as a savings tool. And again, I wasn't necessarily we were looking at real estate as that, right? As that vehicle to preserve that. And we're good examples of people that are like, you see the conversation on Twitter about Bitcoin demonetizing real estate. We've sold our rental properties and are all in on Bitcoin. And so that is happening. And I think people realize it. And so I think, as it relates to athletes, like, kind of bringing forward those high earning years to early in your life and then trying to, create a cushion on the backside, Bitcoin's a very good vehicle for that.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm curious to hear like your perspective as someone that had, real estate and rental properties. Like what was the catalyst for you guys to take that next step and be like, actually, I can just hold Bitcoin and potentially be better off here?
Yeah, I mean, I think that whole trend has accelerated obviously in the last few years. So we, and it's been a mix, right? I mean, I still like real estate. Like I was at this company, we built our own house in Hawaii over the last couple of years, which was a bucket list thing for me. It was an amazing process. And so I like real estate because I actually, I just have a passion for architecture and houses and things like that. So I don't think it's, that's still a component of our life and sort of portfolio, so to speak, but strictly rental property as either, preserving purchasing power or income, Bitcoin is clearly outpacing it, and has for years. And so I think, when we invested in real estate, it was always more like we could see, like, that's where you could see the number go up, right? I grew up in Boulder. It was like every year houses got more expensive. We were fortunate to get on the ladder, earlier. And that is where we put most of our savings during our racing careers, was into that as a savings vehicle. And as Bitcoin has matured, if you do the research, it's pretty clear that Bitcoin is being demonetized in Bitcoin terms. If you look at a chart of real estate prices against Bitcoin, it's, down and to the right. So that has become an easier decision to sort of go all in. And ultimately, I think once you get to the point where you've been through a few cycles and you're willing to ride out the volatility, there is nothing that's interesting to me as an investment other than Bitcoin at this point.
This episode is sponsored by Sound Advisory, an Unchained affiliate. If you can't talk about your Bitcoin wealth with your financial advisor, it might be time to find a new advisor. Sound Advisory is a leading financial advisory firm for long-term Bitcoin holders like yourself. If you need help optimizing taxes, establishing goals, creating a distribution plan for Bitcoin wealth, or designing estate and inheritance plans, then check out Sound Advisory at thesoundadvisory.com for more information. That's thesoundadvisory.com. Now back to the show.
Yeah, I think the topic of athletes in Bitcoin is so interesting because like we've seen, I feel like major football players and major soccer players come out and say like, oh, I'm accepting part of my salary or whatever in Bitcoin. And then we haven't really seen, at least to my knowledge, like many extreme sport athletes say that they're doing this. Why do you think that is? Or maybe is it just like they're so small that
maybe it's so small. I mean, the other thing is none of us are pulling down NFL salaries, right? When I say high earning years, that's a relative term compared to like NFL football players. But there are a couple of things I think that there's a few things. One, for the appeal side, there's a couple of things that I think Bitcoin resonates very well with athletes. Athletes generally successful athletes have a very low time preference. That we working towards something like the Olympics as a goal, it's a 4-year cycle. You're literally planning, training and racing calendars, not daily training plans, but the big picture is like a 4-year cycle that you're working towards to peak for a certain event. And certainly within a year, you're operating on a longer time scale. So I think Bitcoin, athletes would be very comfortable with the length that it takes to realize the benefit. And then I think the other thing that athletes intuitively understand is proof of work. I think that hard money in general, I think that's why you've seen some, like NFL players, something like that, like pay me in Bitcoin, that it's hard money, and it's like, they think the idea of, a proof of work where there's real substance behind it, instead of something like the US dollar, that's resonant with athletes because, no one can do your training for you. And there aren't shortcuts. Like you have to, if you don't put in the work, it's evident to yourself pretty quickly that you're not going to get the results. So I think in terms of like dropping the orange pill on athletes, have a handful of times, those points are pretty resonant.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I think like Bitcoin is kind of counterculture to like normal society. And I also feel like, mountain biking is kind of, or extreme sports in general is kind of counterculture as well. Like, do you have any thoughts on like that kind of clash or matchup?
Yeah, no, I think it is a little bit like that too. And I think that is, when you said maybe why isn't there as much adoption? The reality is like Bitcoin is still like kind of a fringe thing to people. Like I think to most people that really aren't, that haven't really done the work to understand it. It's still like just not that interesting. Like they don't get the why. But I think that's changing a little bit, right? I think that number one, the ecosystem is certainly maturing. The messaging is maturing. And I also think that people they have some intuitive sense that something is broken, right? In the economy, whether it's the economy. And then there's things broken beyond the economy. And that's maybe a little bit farther down the rabbit hole where you're like, you get to the like, okay, Bitcoin fixes everything, even culturally, right? But I think that it's hard, like unless you have someone who really has like the intellectual curiosity to say what is underneath this, you're kind of fighting an uphill battle to, get people to adopt it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Did the fact that Bitcoin was kind of extreme or fringe, did that, concern you at all or make you skeptical at all? Like at first or
no? I've always been sort of on the fringe. So that was never a deterrent to me. So
fair. Yeah. I guess from my perspective, like one thing that kind of scared me early on was like seeing smart traditional finance people like completely discount it. But then once I like did the work and acknowledged like, or tried to understand Bitcoin, read books, listen to podcasts or whatever, I was like, these very smart people just don't know what they're talking about. So it's obvious that maybe they're missing something here.
Yeah,
so that was kind
of I think so too. And that has been my experience too. And I think that's been, I've been sort of thankful that my journey into like, let's say kind of like all in Bitcoiner has been kind of a long road because it allows you to develop the conviction necessary, like a little bit at a time. I don't think you can get it overnight, because you realize you're like, these experts are wrong. Like these people that are self-proclaimed experts about this, or you read an article about it and you're like, that's factually incorrect, and then that opens this whole door into like, well, what else have I been digesting my entire life that, from so-called experts that's just as off base once you become an expert in one thing,
Yeah. Do you have any other, like, I'm curious from your perspective as an Olympian and a mountain biker, like, are there things that you came across that, coaches or experts in, being mountain bikers or just athletes and working out in general? Like, is there something that you're like, this is completely wrong and it's kind of the norm to do this?
I think there was quite a bit of that. I think, exercise science is really one of those things that's constantly evolving. There's like things are very different even now than when we were racing, you used to have to try to like not eat, like hardly eat because you had to be thin. And now like fueling is much more refined. Like there's a lot of like real science that goes into that. But I think that, definitely it's true that like, maybe that did set me up for having a natural skepticism toward maybe a common narrative. Because I think as an athlete, I was so close to things that was like, okay, this works or this doesn't. And yet that is not that's not the consensus narrative about the way, sports works or coaching or whatever, things like that. Because I think that is probably plausible. Certainly from the media perspective, like we would, I think I do think I probably got some level of ingrained skepticism from that, because when I did, lots and lots of interviews over the course of my career, and to see how many of those were not reflective of what the content of the actual interview was, or the misunderstanding of something like that, like that was commonplace, right? You get an interview about a race, and it's like, that wasn't really what happened, but somehow that's what got communicated. And so I think maybe that did set me up for, a healthy skepticism that has led me further down the Bitcoin rabbit hole.
Do you think athletes in general are more likely to have this healthy skepticism for everything, or no?
I think it's possible. I think that it probably takes. I think for whether it's a team sport or an individual sport, like ultimately you're responsible for your own performance, and so you have to figure out what works for you, and what works for someone will most certainly not work for someone else. So you really do have to do a lot of self-exploration even to figure out what your own optimum path is. So I think that there's probably some truth to that.
Makes sense. If you mentioned that you tried to orange pill other, professional mountain bikers, what is your pitch to someone that, doesn't study finance full time, may not understand computer science very well, but they are a professional athlete or a professional mountain biker in particular? Like, what's your, pitch? What do you typically say?
Yeah. And it hasn't really been, I've been a little bit removed I've been a little removed from like the actual like top level of the professional athlete, the mountain bike scene for, a handful of years now. So it hasn't really been that, but it's more like, people who are, either in my situation of sort of like retired professionals, or, like high level recreational, athletes that have crossed over with us, but in different sports too, not necessarily just mountain biking. And again, some successful, some not, but, I think the biggest thing is you can't hit someone over the head with it and convince anybody that Bitcoin is the solution to, whatever. I think they need to be, like I said, pretty curious and ask some questions, but I think there are some hints you can drop. The what is money is a really good one. Like really, I think most people, myself included, never really thought about what money is, and so when I read the Bitcoin Standard, that was one that I think that was really helped me on my sort of conviction journey. And then I recently finished Lynn Alden's book, Broken Money, which that's one that I'm going to continue to recommend to people, because I think it really articulates some of the problems of our economy and culture in a pretty, in a way that you're like, okay, well, what is the solution for this, right? And I think people feel it. I think inflation right now is something that obviously people feel in their own lives. It is undeniable, like how much more expensive everything has become in the last 3 or 4 years. So that's an obvious inroad, right? To say, okay, well, if your savings are in Bitcoin instead of the US dollar, all of these things have become cheaper over the last 5 years instead of more expensive. And, like our family is living proof of that. And so I think that's going to continue for sure. I think it's, I'm not one to make like short-term price predictions, but I think that the long-term trend is very solid at this point. And I feel very comfortable, at least with that caveat. I think that's the other thing too, right? You don't want, in terms of orange pilling people, I think you don't want to make big promises, right? About like, okay, Bitcoin, the number's going to just go up and you're going to be set, because you have to, it takes a while to develop the conviction to hold through, the volatility, which is the price that you pay for that.
Yep. Yeah. 100%. What's been the typical reaction when you talk to some of these retired professionals? Like, are they like immediately skeptical? Some of them buy Bitcoin? What do they?
Some of I think some some of them have. So interesting. So a good friend of ours, another athlete couple, we actually went to El Salvador together.
Nice.
So went down. They were not Bitcoiners when we went down, but they are now. And so, which was an interesting story. So they actually went down there we went down for a surf trip. They had been going down for surfing. We went all down together. And my wife, Heather, and I, we had been wanting to go to just see Bitcoin Beach and like sort of like experience what is this real like closed loop system down here? Does it work? Is it real? Like all of that, kind of thing that you see, the energy that's going on down there. And it was incredible. It was like such an awesome trip. Met some Bitcoiners down there. And then I think that was a really good, our friends who were not and ended up being orange pilled on the trip, they like seeing it in action, I think really helped. And then just like immersing them in that narrative, and kind of like, here's why, here's what we were doing, because they were really interested. They were like, here, you're going to Bitcoin, or you're going to El Salvador just because you want to, check out the Bitcoin thing. That was crazy to them. And so, but they're all in now. So it's interesting.
Very cool. Yeah. I kind of want to hear more about like your trip to El Salvador. Like I've not been to El Salvador. Yeah. Was it a cool experience? Like, what did you see? What did you expect? What happened?
It was really cool. So the pace of, obviously we followed, what Bukele has done there. And, with pretty much starting with like the adoption of Bitcoin as legal tender when he did, back, a few years ago now, and had been wanting to go down there. And it was very impressive. Like the amount of energy of, I'd say energy and optimism is very real when you speak to locals there. We were mostly in the El Zonte area.
In this frontier moment, Germany is talking about Bitcoin Beach in El Salvador. This coastal village, also known as El Zonte, is a Bitcoin beach in El Salvador, originally known as a world surfing mecca. Now it's one of the first towns in the world that is actually using Bitcoin as money for payments and savings. Historically, El Zonte was a sleepy fishing village with very limited economic opportunities. However, its transformation began when an anonymous donor gifted a substantial amount of Bitcoin to the community with the condition that it be used to create a sustainable Bitcoin ecosystem. And now back to Jeremy.
And it was there's an optimism there that doesn't feel like it exists here right now in the United States. Which was really energizing. I mean, everything from like young kids learning about, Bitcoin and it's definitely still happening in fits and starts down there. It's not like everybody takes it. I think there is still some healthy skepticism of it. But there's a lot of positives too. I mean, you can pay for, Pustas and get your beer out of the cooler. By the beach and pay with Lightning, and it's sweet. But not everyone takes it. I think one of the coolest things to me was just learning how, these people locals that, they never had a bank account, putting cash under the mattress, and then now actually have a vehicle to save, right? And instead of just wanting to turn that around because you don't want cash under the mattress, right? Whether you're going to get robbed or whatever, you just want to like spend it immediately again. I think there's this cultural change that can happen with Bitcoin as digital money, where you begin to like build wealth. And I think you can see that happening at like a macro level there. I mean, there's tons of, it's like everything from construction to development, road construction. It's really happening quickly, and it was a really cool trip. Looking forward to going back.
Interesting. So generally you're saying like a lot of people had like more inclination to like save for the future and then build like more longer term projects that will help their community, not just
exactly. And that's it. It lowers. I mean, that's the thing. The ability to save lowers everyone's time preference, and you can see it changing things down there.
Very cool. That's awesome. I'm curious on this as well. You mentioned like your wife and you obviously both, are bullish on Bitcoin. Like, is she, as deep into Bitcoin as you are? What's that dynamic like?
Yeah, she is. She's like as into it as I am, and like it's totally So it's awesome. Yeah, we're both. There was never any like friction. Like I'm going to buy more Bitcoin. It was like she's been along for the journey, and she's done the homework. She listens to all the podcasts, and so yeah, fun.
What were you guys just both on the exact same course, like going at the same pace the entire time, or like were you ever ahead, or was she ever ahead trying to?
No, I was more into it first, sort of, and I was the one that sort of got the stack going, and then kind of like pulled her in more. But then now she's like more, just as interested in all the stuff as I am. So yeah, it's fun. It's fun because we get to sort of cheerlead it together.
Nice, yeah. How was that process like? Like when you were kind of ahead of her first, did you just keep reading books and podcasts and like not stop talking about it, or did she get curious about it, or how did that work?
Kind of. I almost like can't remember actually, but like I think it was. I mean, I think it accelerated in like 2020. I think when it was quiet for a long time, like in the when after the bull market peak of like 20K, and then it went down to like 3. That was sort of just me like quietly stacking all that time, and then it wasn't really worth like talking about. And then all of a sudden it started like taking off again, and then I think she got more interested. She got pulled in. I think actually I would say the catalyst for her becoming more fully involved was going through actually this process with Unchained of setting up our, getting everything sorted out. Like, hey, okay, we're doing multi-sig vol. We're getting this sorted out. We've got kids now, right? We've got to, if something happens, we are responsible, right? So it's like she, kind of taking on that responsibility of holding keys and what that means. And I think that was probably the catalyst for her full immersion into it.
That's really interesting. Yeah, because I guess Bitcoin does enable or force people to become kind of more responsible for their personal savings. And I guess if you have kids and you were looking far into the future, you want to make sure that you're securing that savings correctly. So that's awesome to hear.
Yeah, no, that's, so that's that was sort of like the fun serendipitous thing for this podcast was, we're both, we're Unchained clients, and got on board with Phil, who I know, was part of putting this podcast together. So that was fun back when he was still doing that. So it's been, but yeah, I think it is. And that is something that I think it's another thing that, is absolutely, I don't want to say a hurdle, but it's a real thing, right? Self-custody. I think Bitcoin, like self-custody is what makes Bitcoin important, right? It's a critical function. And it is a lot of responsibility to, when you're talking about, if you're family and you're truly all in on it, you're your own bank and you have to really take that responsibility seriously. And it's not for everyone, I think, right? I think there are people that's probably too much, like they just don't want to do it. I don't think that will ever not be the case, but I think there's enough people that do want control over their own money that, there will be enough people that are interested in self-custody that I think it's still, there's an ocean of growth for, for platforms like Unchained or, collaborative custody, things like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. Do you think other professional athletes like the, big football players or soccer players that have announced that they're taking a portion of their salary in Bitcoin or whatnot, do you think that they truly understand Bitcoin, or not truly understand Bitcoin, but are like kind of deep down the rabbit hole and trying to learn, more every single day? Or do you think that they're just kind of like capitalizing on this number go up trend that it just happens to be Bitcoin today?
I think it's probably a little bit of both. I think there are probably some. I think there are some even that are, sort of more active personalities on Bitcoin Twitter or whatever that I think they really do get it. And I think some probably it's the flavor of the month, right? It's like if it's the bull market time and everything's pumping, then they're more inclined to kind of jump on the bandwagon. But I think there's certainly some that understand it at a pretty high level.
Yeah, that's fair. Do you know any other mountain bikers that were Olympic athletes or just big in the space that are like deep into Bitcoin like you are?
I don't. I'm not. I don't. So who knows? Maybe they'll see this podcast and get back in touch.
Yeah, maybe they'll DM you. That'd be awesome. Yeah, you kind of touched on this earlier a little bit, but I'm curious to see if you have any other thoughts. Like you mentioned, athletes have this early part in their career where they're making a lot of money relative to other people their age, and then you mentioned like after their sports career, they're somewhat unemployable, and so they have like this potential drop off, I guess, in their like earnings. Is that the largest challenge for an athlete that Bitcoin can help fix, like encouraging them to save when they're making a lot of money, or are there other challenges that Bitcoin might help?
I think that's a big one, right? I think that is a big one. I think I'd say one of the deeper things that I think athletes struggle with is probably that your whole personal identity is like your athlete persona. When you're an athlete, that's like the only way people know you, right? You're sort of like, even, mountain bike racing, we joked that we were like D-list celebrities. Like we weren't in a big sport and we weren't famous, but within that little niche we were. And so I think everybody only sees you as like your athlete personality. And so I think that I think a lot of people struggle with like, what is my personal identity outside of being an athlete? I think the way that, saving in Bitcoin, this is the whole, like, maybe it's a stretch, but like maybe Bitcoin fixes everything, right? Like, I think if you're less worried, if you have a little bit more financial security for a transition like that, it's probably a little bit easier to explore what that path forward looks like as you kind of recultivate a new identity, not as an athlete, right? If you have a little bit more breathing room from, immediate financial pressure, you may be able to make better decisions around what does my future career path look like? What am I really passionate about? How do I leverage what I've done as an athlete into something in the future?
Yeah, I really like that. Basically, Bitcoin gives you another wave of personal freedom to be able to explore different avenues and not just, be worried about your next paycheck and what you're going to do with the money.
Yeah. I mean, I think that, and that's been the case for our family, too, right now. Like I'm still, I work for company Studio Shed. I love it. I'm not like retired or anything, but, Bitcoin as a savings technology, we certainly have, the flexibility to like pursue, things that we are passionate about and, with a little bit less, day-to-day pressure, I think. And I think everyone's in our world is looking for that right now, to try to, can you get out from underneath kind of that, just the inflationary, hamster wheel of everything's more expensive, I make less. And, it can be hard to get started, obviously, depending on, the circumstances, but, the slow and steady wins the race. And, Bitcoin, well, when I started stacking, it was not a lot of money. It was a little bit, and it grows over time.
Yeah, definitely. You touched on it a little bit earlier, but can you kind of tell us a little more about like the company that you work for and like kind of what you do now day to day?
Yeah. So the company it's called Studio Shed. Studio Shed, you'll Google it, you find it. We do prefab. We started doing, it grew out of our mountain bike racing career. It was, Heather and I, between the two of us, had like 20 mountain bikes and nowhere to put them. And I designed and built like just a real cool, fancy, modern storage shed in my backyard. My now business partner loved the idea, copied it. We kicked it around for a couple of years and then started the business in 2008. I was still racing full time at the time, and he had another business that he was winding down. But it really started to take off in like 2012, 2013, turned into like prefabricated backyard home offices, and then small studios, art studios, creative studios. And then we've since moved into like accessory dwelling unit and small home construction. The project that my wife and I built in Hawaii is a prototype home concept, and it's beautiful. We love it. It's a family of four comfortably. So we're sort of living the dream in our studio shed out there. But it's been great. So then I have one of the founders. I still help run the company day to day, and then we're kind of more focused on the marketing side of it, marketing director, digital marketing.
Very cool.
Yeah. So that's my post-athlete career carve out.
Nice. I love it. Can you kind of tell us a little more about the small home construction? That kind of seems interesting and maybe related to Bitcoin, like in the sense that, everyone's trying to buy bigger houses and hopefully the price of their house goes up and they're storing wealth in houses. And then maybe you theoretically come in and, offer a smaller, cheaper house that.
Yeah, then that is a trend right now. So we are like, I've got a pretty good background in the housing market at this point between, both our own speculation and then also a company now. There is a very strong trend toward smaller homes. Inflationary pressures have really hit the construction industry. Everything is more expensive. So there is true, like just monetary asset inflation for house prices. But the cost of construction has gone up dramatically. It's very difficult to actually get a high quality house on the ground for, even what real estate prices were, call it 5 or 6 years ago. So that cost pressure is real. And it is one of the things that's driving housing out of reach for people. I think that's the fact that housing is so out of reach for the current generation, I think is a huge problem. I think home ownership, maybe without the monetary aspects of it, still is a huge form of stability. I think culturally, I think it's an important thing. And so we really at Studio Shed we really want to help that. And so there is a trend towards smaller, higher quality construction, right? Not the big McMansion built out of, cheap materials that is going to fall apart and require a ton of maintenance. So I think there is an element of kind of lower, it's crossed over, lower time preference, housing solutions, right? Where it's like maybe bigger isn't better. Like I said, our house in Hawaii is under 1,000 square feet. Family of four live in it very comfortably. And so bigger is not always better. And so I think there's something there. And I think that, and more communities it's going to be a requirement. I think you're going to see more smaller homes and more, of just that, just for a variety of considerations. But I think, we're certainly trying to solve some segment of the housing problem by offering a good solution for customers that is like within the bounds of what's possible, affordable.
Yeah, very interesting. So is it cheaper, I guess, than a traditional house, or is like the quality so much higher that it's somewhat comparable?
It depends on where you are. Is the short answer. So it's the building is they're pretty high quality. So they would be considered like high end residential construction. But they're cheaper in most areas of the country than stick building. There are certain things that are very advantageous to do in a factory. We're sort of we term it hybrid prefab. So it's panelized, 2D wall sections that are flat packed. And then a lot of the traditional field work is still just traditional field construction for the interior. So we think we've hit on kind of a good blend of do what's efficient in the factory, and then do what's efficient in the field. And so there's a variety of advantages to both those things. And so it's generally a more cost effective solution than stick building in most areas of the country. And the only thing that you give up is a little bit of ability to like customize. So you have to stay within a little bit more of a box, so to speak.
Gotcha. Yeah, that makes sense. Very, very interesting. 2 more questions and we can probably start to close it out. What do you think the biggest risk is to Bitcoin?
Oh, that's a good question. And I have thought about it because right, when you're all in, you kind of think about it. I think there is, I would put myself in not like the ossification camp, but in the very, very slow and deliberate development camp. I think at this point, the protocol should like not be messed with too much, right? I think it's more like, I guess I would consider myself more of like the monetary maximalist use case for Bitcoin. I would like to sort of see that. I think like just sort of preserving it's too important to like mess with basically. So I think protocol development risk would be one. That's probably the biggest one that I would see is really tinkering with it at this point. I think it works well. There's always, regulatory risk is always a thing, right? And there's always, I tend to be in the camp that the game theory of regulatory risk will sort of keep that at a lower level. It's ultimately like it is kind of this unstoppable technology. And I think there's enough like positive movement behind it at this point that I think it will be like there's it's the joke, right, of the then they fight you stage. Like I think that is going to happen. There will certainly be legal battles to be fought about, Bitcoin or self-custody or whatever the battle of the day is going to be. But I think Bitcoin will ultimately prevail. I think sanity will prevail on that front. Because it is just a neutral technology, and so but it's still going to be a road. It'll be a long road, I think, to like real widespread adoption. I think it's still it's still pretty early.
Yeah, definitely agree. It's still pretty early. Is there anything that you believe about Bitcoin or anything in general that most Bitcoiners would disagree with you on?
Well, that's another good question. I don't know. I think I'm pretty close to like most of the consensus views on a lot of that. I think, I don't know. I guess it depends. I think that the Bitcoiners, it's a pretty big tent, right? There's a lot of different, there are a lot of different sort of flavors of Bitcoiner, right? From like the hardcore, cyberpunks to like, embrace the ETF, number go up maximalists kind of thing. And I think that, I guess like there's probably, I think I'm probably somewhat of like a centrist, right? I think that like if Bitcoin is going to become, if someday you get this hyper Bitcoinization, it's going to become the world reserve currency. We're going to have things like ETFs and futures price manipulation, right? We're just going to accept all of that stuff. And so it's more like, how do we deal with everything productively as opposed to, even things like NFTs, right? It's like, I think that's kind of like, it's that, I think it's like spam on the blockchain, but like, should we be filtering it out? Probably not. I think there's like too many, there's probably, I'm sure there's some things that I could get in arguments with other Bitcoiners about, but it's, at the end of the day, I'd like to think we're all pulling the train in the same direction.
Yeah, I tend to agree. I feel like a lot of arguments, at least somewhat recently, have been over like minor things that may like affect like the short-term future in like a very small way, but doesn't really change the end result of what Bitcoin is likely becoming, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think people do get caught up in some pretty small battles. I think that's fair.
Cool. Well, Jeremy, I really appreciate you taking the time to sit down and record with us on the Bitcoin Frontier. Is there anything I didn't ask you that you want to bring up? Or maybe
I don't know. I think we hit a lot of it, so I think that's good. I think the only other thing I guess I would mention, I thought about preluding my mountain bike recap with this, but for anyone that's interested, if they're interested, they look it up or anything. When I was racing, I changed my name. So when I was mountain bike racing, my name was Jeremy Horton Kabelski. My nickname was JHK. All my racing career stuff is under that name. And it's like not a story, but when we had kids, my wife and I, we all just changed our names and made a whole new family. So that would be the only like addendum, I guess, is if anyone's interested in learning more. My racing career was not under Jeremy Nova.
Gotcha. Yeah, I was wondering what the HK was when
That's it. Horton Kabelski. I ditched the double hyphenated name. So.
Oh, gotcha. Interesting. Cool. Well, it's cool to know, and people can definitely look you up after this. Well, thanks again. This was great.
Yeah, super fun. Thanks for having me.